Hey everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and we continue our look at the Neo-Archangelsk variation. This is, I believe, part 24 in our series on the quick Ruy Lopez, and I don't anticipate this being a particularly quick video. And the reason is that we're going to take a look at two fairly well analyzed subvariations within this complex. So let's go ahead and start. This, of course, is the Ruy, for those of you who missed the first 23 episodes and don't know your opening theory very well. And this is what makes the Neo-Archangelsk variation, as opposed to bishop to b7 here, which is the traditional Archangelsk, and the bishop often ends up going to c5 anyway. Alright, so last time we looked primarily at lines where white played a quick knight takes e5, going for the fork trick. We're not going to this time. So here we're going to take a look at lines, two different lines, very different lines. One that emerges from this position. So c3, d6, d4, bishop b6, and now h3. So a4, castle, or sorry, a4, rook to b8, knight a3, castles, and so on would lead to the main line that we're going to look at next time, but h3. So this prevents the black bishop, obviously, from pinning. And now black has a choice between two moves. But before we jump into this, let me quickly show you the other variation we're going to look at, which goes like this. So a4, rook b8, c3, d6, d4, bishop b6, and again, a takes b5, and this leads to what we're going to look at next time with castles, knight b5, bishop g4, and so on. But the second line that we'll look at today starts with a5. When in the stem game, black played knight takes a5, which is now considered to be very, very dangerous and is almost never played. So the main move is bishop to a7, and we'll investigate this further a bit later. So let's begin with this line. So c3, d6, d4, bishop b6, h3. And now here we're going to have a bit of slower play. So this is not quite as fast and dynamic as the lines we're going to look at next time, and in a way it's even a bit more slow than what we looked at last time. So yeah, these positions tend to be very characteristic, I would say, of a closed Ruy Lopez. So it's a little unusual that the bishop is on b6 as opposed to e7, so that creates obviously some differences, but you still have many of the same kinds of ideas. So in the bishop to e7 lines, black will often, after castling, play rook to e8. So let me do some coloring here. Castle, rook e8, bishop f8, g6, bishop g7. And with the rook on e8 and the bishop on this diagonal, black will pressure the white pawns. Well, you got the same thing going on here. It's just the bishop's doing it more directly from b6. The potential drawback, of course, is that black's king side is a little bit less well defended, but again, we have a lot of the same motifs going on here. Alright, well, in this position, sometimes black castles, but bishop to b7 is also quite normal and scores even better. And this, as I've noted in previous shows, gives you essentially an old Archangelsk where white has kicked away a tempo on h3. Alright, so from here, rook e1, castles, and now white has tried various things, none of which we're going to look at in really great detail. So this is more just my letting you know what's going on. So if a4, generally h6 is the reaction. Bishop to e3 is possible. And now black has tried various moves. Knight a5 is one. Another is e takes d4, which we'll see fairly regularly in this system. And then finally there's h6. And after knight b to d2, rook e8, we reach a position that we'll see below from a Svidler-Karawanaghi. That's another thing about this variation. There are an awful lot of transpositional possibilities, which it's a bit of a burden at times to kind of keep them all straight, but well, that's just the nature of this line. All right, so bishop to g5 is another move, of course. There's a reason why black keeps playing h6. So h6, bishop h4, rook e8, d5, and now knight to b8. And black has done very well here. Common idea is for black to follow up quickly with c6, breaking up the white center before he can really stabilize behind it and try to build up kingside attacking play. So I would say that black is probably equal here, and certainly his results have borne out that evaluation. So bishop to b7 I think is quite a reasonable way to play. But castling is also very common, and as I said, you will often find transpositions here. Alright, rook e1 is common, but okay, we'll say bishop to e3. Note, of course, that knight takes e4 loses immediately to bishop to d5. So bishop to b7 is possible here, but okay, we'll say h6. Again, rook e1 is possible, but we'll say knight b to d2. Bishop to b7 is possible, but okay, rook to e8, rook e1. And now finally, we'll look at two lines, one of which is bishop to b7. But bishop to d7 was tried recently by Caruana, I think a couple of times. So we'll come back to that in a moment. But first, bishop to b7, which reaches a position we've mentioned several times now, or a position that could have arisen several times given black playing bishop to b7 earlier. So on move 9, 10, or 11. This is move 12. Okay. Now, here, white has tried at least a couple of moves. The main move at this point is d5. And after this, then knight to e7. And now white takes. And one advantage of this for white is that now there's no c7, c6 breaking up that central block. So that's the good news. The bad news is that white's bishop on b3 is not really brilliant either. And black, with his knights where they are, and the second knight coming to g6, really is not in any danger of coming in second place in the kingside race for the build-up. So bishop c2, knight g6, bishop d3, and here black has tried lots of moves, many of which seem to be pretty good, including knight to d7, bishop f1. This is a fear against Georgiev game, V Georgiev, not Kirill, and here maybe knight to c5 should be about equal. Okay, so that's on d5. So bishop to c2 attempts to keep the position a bit more supple. Alright, so from here, black has tried a couple of moves. So there's e takes d4, and now white has to be careful on how he recaptures. If he takes with the knight, I believe he's worse. Knight takes, bishop takes, c5, and black is doing quite well, has pressure against e4, can achieve d5 at leisure, and black's bishops are just very good. Similarly, bishop takes d4 is not so fantastic either. So knight takes. Okay, now if knight takes, then g6 to take away the f5 square, and black again has more central options than white does, and is slightly better. If cd, then I think c5 is slightly better for black, as is knight h5. Again, white is really not all that well set up for his kingside play, while black's bishops and rook on e8 exert significant pressure against the white center. So, c takes d4 I think is the best, but still, after knight to b4, I think black is still in very good shape. So e takes d4 is a good response. The more patient, Breyer-like knight to b8 is also quite good. This was played by Caruana against Spidler, so I mentioned this already. So de, and now bishop takes b6. So again, well, not really again. I was going to say before the idea, or one value to this move, was that it stopped black from playing c7, c6 to bust up the white center with the pawn on d5. But here, of course, there are no d pawns, so it's a bit different. And here, black, I think, can achieve a good position. In fact, Caruana drew very easily in Hanty-Mansisk last year, essentially creating kind of a dark squared blockade on the queen side. So c4, b4, knight f1, knight b to d7, queen d2, knight c5. And, you know, if the queens get traded off, then black is in great shape. Maybe plays a5, and nothing's going to happen to him. So white at least tries to make a little imbalance in the position by taking on b4. Black recaptures on e4. And here too, black is just fine, and in fact they agree to a draw in this position. So nothing really doing there for white in this variation with, or after bishop to b7, bishop c2. Anyway, for whatever reason, and I don't really know what it would be, except perhaps that black has very few winning chances in that particular line. So maybe just out of fighting, for fighting points, Caruana started playing bishop to d7. So he played this against, I think against Navarra. Yeah, Navarra's had this a couple of times. Once he beat Onashuk from Hanty-Mansisk again, that was last year. And Navarra and Caruana played this in Vaikanze and drew a long game. And then finally, Caruana very nearly lost with this to Ho Yifan in the Reykjavik Open earlier this year as well. So let's jump in and take a look. So here, bishop c2 was played in the two Navarra games. All right, Onashuk played rook to b8, but ended up slightly worse. So a3, queen e7, b4, just blockading the queen side, and really restricting black's possibilities. Rook b to d8, which already at least looks like it could be a loss of a tempo. Rook c1, a5, d5, takes, and queen to e2. And white has a number of possible breaks on the queen side, while black is in a much more reactive mode. White also maybe has some chances to build on the king side. Anyway, the game didn't last very long. It went 9 more moves with Navarra winning, and I would say he's a bit better here. So after bishop to c2, when Caruana faced Navarra, instead of rook to b8, he played queen to b8, which was something that he wanted to achieve against Hu Yifan, but couldn't, thanks to the way she played the position. So after queen to b8, Navarra played a3, again analogous to his treatment of the opening against Onashuk. But now a5, bishop to d3, queen a7. So that's the point. I think this idea goes back to Rubinstein, also in a Rui, but a slightly different circumstance. But to pressure on the long diagonal, the a7 g1 diagonal. Well, here Navarra took on b5, and we had a fairly lengthy exchanging sequence here, and this position is equal. So the game, as I said, was drawn in about another 45 moves from here. All right, so that's from, as I said, Navarra, Caruana, Vaikanze in this here. Another try, and this is the Ho Yifan game. I'm sorry, I went to the wrong spot. Yeah, I don't want this position, I want this position. So bishop to d7, and then Hu Yifan played queen to b1, kind of ironically anticipating black's queen b8 idea. All right, so here I believe Caruana in his post-game comments mentioned that queen to b8 is a move that he would have liked to have played, but he didn't really like a4. And here, okay, if he plays b4, then knight c4, or is coming. He's weakened the c4 square. He can't play queen to a7, of course, because if a takes b5. And if he plays ed, cd, knight to b4, then white plays e5. And after knight f to d5, knight e4 leaves the black king a bit exposed. I mean, you can see there are possible tricks with bishop h6, and knight f6, and queen g6, taking advantage of pressure on this diagonal. So white's pieces are all pointed rather menacingly. Well, they're all either in the center or on the queen side, but they're pointing very menacingly at the black king side. So for reasons like that, he decided to play knight to a5 to chase white's bishop off the dangerous a2 g8 diagonal. So the game continued bishop c2, c5, d5, c4. And now a typical Ruy Lopez motif, b4. So white aims to restrict this knight and send it to b7. Now here, if bishop takes e3, Caruana was happy about the idea of a line like this: rook e3, knight b7, a4, knight h5. So although the knight on b7 is bad, he was hoping to play, or he would have played something like knight to f4 and queen f6, when he felt that white's kingside would be a bit exposed. And even the knight from b7 could be recycled into the game with knight to d8, f6, knight f7, and so on. But what he didn't like was, after bishop takes e3, the idea of f takes e3, then knight b7 and a4. And he didn't see either what to do on the queen side or on the king side, because the pawn on e3 takes the f4 square away from the knight. So, and white can continue with rook f1, queen e1, queen g3, and maybe have the better play on the king side as well as the queen side. Alright, so because of this, then, he decided to play cb, AB, bishop E3, rook E3. And now, at least, there's potential counterplay against the C3 pawn, and the knight H5, F4 idea is still possible, and might continue from there with queen F6 and so on. But this is a worse structure for him, though, so that's the drawback. So with the black pawn on C4, it helped to restrict white's position, and also prevented ideas like B4 followed by C4, which we'll see here. So in the game, Caruana played knight to B7, B4, knight H5, bishop D3, which is a good move, so that on knight F4, which happened, bishop to F1 keeps the king side nice and solid. And white will go for C4 on the queen side, and can play consolidating moves like king to H2 and G3 as necessary on the king side. So Caruana played rook F8 with the obvious idea to play F5. Here, white played C4. King H2 is possible, but then G5 is one idea, with the idea of H5, H4 maybe. And another idea, I think again this is Caruana, is F5. And now, okay, if G3, FE4, knight E4, knight D5. So E takes F5, takes, queen B3. But here white's better. So queen D7, C4, threatening C5. And here it's starting to look dangerous with knight to B6 as a threat. So king H2 is also quite decent. Alright, so C4 is the game move. Takes, takes. A5. And Caruana was, I guess, initially optimistic here, but after BA, knight A5, queen B4, less so. So after knight takes C4, knight C4, or rook A8, sorry. Here in this position, white was better. Black was really hanging on for quite a while with tricks, but still, Hu Yifan managed to outplay her higher-rated opponent and reach this position after the time control, which was simply winning. And unfortunately for her, she came up with the bad idea to play knight takes F7. After king F7, rook F3, king E6, knight B5, maybe she had missed rook to B8, which gets out of the fork, avoids any forks, threatens bishop takes E4. So rook F2, bishop E4, and here a draw is agreed. Going back, instead of knight takes F7, either the obvious knight A to C4, or the peculiar looking but also good knight to D7 would have maintained a winning advantage for her. So this line looks like maybe white has some chances for an edge after bishop to D7. One thing I want to note is this position after queen to B4. Instead of knight takes C4 as played by Caruana, there was a really tactically fantastic idea that black could have tried. And that's knight takes G2. So the idea is that if king takes G2, then knight C4. And if rook takes A8, then knight E3 is check. And after FE3, queen A8, black is up the exchange in a pawn and winning. Well, queen takes D6 will take care of the pawn part, but still black should win this. If knight takes C4, then rook A1, queen D6, F6, and black is again up the exchange and is probably winning this, or is at least clearly better. So king takes G2 is no good. Rook takes A5 also favors black. Knight E3, takes, 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 queen to B8, and here the rook and pawn seem to be a bit better functioning, or maybe to give very slightly better prospects than white's two knights. I mean, the double E pawns don't help, the H3 pawn is isolated, white's bishop on C4 is functioning fairly poorly. However, after knight takes G2, white does have a path to perhaps a very slight edge, maybe, and that's rook E to A3, taking advantage of the pin here, and of course rescuing the rook on E3 from the attack. After knight F4, rook A5, white has won a piece, but takes, takes, queen F6, bishop H3, and then, for instance, H5. Here, black has two pawns for the piece, but a good structure. So even if the attack doesn't really pan out, it's going to be difficult for white to prove the win here, or at least it'll be a lot of work. But of course, the queens are on, and so that too is going to keep white thoroughly occupied for the foreseeable future. All right, well, that's all that I wanted to say about this kind of slower line where you end up with this position here, right, or bishop to b7. So this setup, again, leads to rather slower play. It can become very interesting, but again, this is more characteristic of a typical closed Ruy-Lopez setup. All right, so the next line we're going to look at starts with a4, rook to b8, c3, d6, d4, bishop b6, and now a5, which was devised by Sergei Dolmatov back in 2000. Now, the idea is really quite a clever one. Of course, bishop takes a5 is terrible because of d5. All right, so that one's a proverbial no-brainer here. Bishop a5 is just bad. But knight takes a5 looks perfectly normal. You hit the bishop, you grab the pawn. What could be wrong with this? Well, the answer is the startling rook takes a5, and then d takes e5. And what does black do? He can't play knight takes e4 because of queen to d5, so this would be a blunder. Because of this, and if you play d takes e5, then queen d8, king d8, knight takes e5 is also very bad for black, threatened by knight f7 as well as knight c6. And notice the knight to c6. Even it doesn't matter that if it's check or not. I mean, if you can put, let's say black plays king to e8, you play knight c6 anyway, as black is unable to save the rook and the bishop both. So this is rather bad for white, or for black as well. White's probably winning, or at least nearly so. Okay, so the right move here is knight to g4. But still, bishop to g5, f6, takes, bishop h4, c5, h3, and here black played h5. Okay, Dolmatov played knight b to d2 and went on to win a brilliant game, but it might have given black a quick opportunity because after knight b to d2, instead of rook to b7, as played by Sivoko in this game from St. Petersburg in 2000, if he had played c4, the position is rather unclear. So it's worth white's taking time out to first bring the bishop outside of the arc, so to speak, and play bishop to d5 first. And here white has a pretty nice edge. So going back to this position after a5, no one plays knight takes a5 anymore. Bishop to a7 is the universal try here. Okay, well now white has a choice between h3 and bishop to e3, which we might kind of half-jokingly call a sort of Yates variation approach, permitting the pin. Here, black can either play e takes d4 or bishop to g4, and again, we can get positions where there are transpositions. All right, well, after bishop to g4, there's a game between Evgeny Nair and Shirov, I think from the Bundesliga in 2010, where Nair played d takes e5, which is not very good. So after this exchange, black really has no problems whatsoever. If anything, he might even have a slight edge at this point. So this is not really very promising. The advantage, quote-unquote, of the one bishop does not come into play here. So knight b to d2 seems right. Okay, castles, h3, and here we'll look at bishop to h5, but ed, cd, and then bishop to h5 is also possible. I mean, this exchange is something that always needs to be considered very seriously. By making it, black achieves a number of things. So he gets to pressure the e-pawn on the e-file with his rook. Sometimes he can play knight to b4, which is both sometimes pretty good for his knight, and also prepares c7, c5, aiming for counterplay with the queenside majority. The drawback of making this exchange is that sometimes white can play e4, e5, and really speed up his own kingside attacking ambitions. Alright, well, black plays bishop to h5 most of the time here. Okay, now there's a game Timofeyev against Shirov that continued queen c2, and after rook to e8 I think black is doing fine here. So d takes e5 I think is maybe the more slightly more testing try. And now bishop e3, e takes f6, bishop d2, fg7, rook e8, takes, knight e5, queen e3, queen f6, king g2. So white is up 2 pawns at the moment, although the g7 pawn could of course disappear at any time. though black wants to be careful about when that time is, as white could theoretically use the G file for his own purposes. Anyway, I think black has just about enough of the material. He may have to suffer for a while before drawing, as indeed happened in the game Kurnasov against Kazimjanov from Rogaska Slatina in 2011. So in that game, the draw was agreed, but after 58 more moves. But still, objectively, black is probably about equal or close. So that's bishop to e3 in a very, very small nutshell. Let's look at the more common h3. So now castles, bishop to e3. And here we've got a couple of moves to look at. 3 moves to look at, actually. Knight takes e4, which looks like a blunder but isn't. E takes d4, and then after c takes d4, knight takes e4, which really looks like a blunder but still isn't. And then finally the main move, which is rook to a8. The idea of which being that white sometimes threatens to play d5, and various pieces, black pieces can be en pris. So for instance, bishop to d7 would be an absolute blunder because d5, bishop takes e3, d takes c6 leaves both black bishops vulnerable to white pawns. And of course, after bishop d7, d5, the knight can't move without dropping the bishop on a7. So that's the idea. All right, well, let's plow through these. On knight takes e4, bishop d5 forks these guys, but black has a defense. E takes d4. So if c takes d4, this will transpose to a position we'll see in a moment. So c takes d4. So on this, say c, 12, e takes d4, 13, c takes d4, knight takes e4. All right, so we'll get back to that in a moment. Instead, we can look at the other captures. Bishop takes e4 and knight takes d4. So on bishop e4, d5, and now white can try a couple of things. If he plays bishop to g5, then of course f6, queen to b3. And again, it looks as if white is winning material, but black has some nice tactical resources here. He plays king to h8, and after bishop takes d5, knight e7. And finally, black will regain his piece. Alright, well, this too looks dangerous because we've got pressure on h7 and pressure against f7. But again, black has a resource. Knight f5. So check, takes, takes. Black is down the exchange, but after knight to d6, taking on e4 and playing bishop to b7, these bishops look very, very greedy, very dangerous. White has to be aware of ideas like, if queen e2, for instance, takes, takes, and then maybe queen g5, or d3 and queen g5. So a lot of tricky things like that involving the g2 square and the two adjacent diagonals. I'm not sure if those lines quite win, but they're very dangerous for white. Okay, instead of bishop to g5, there's also the simple knight takes d4. And this is a position we're going to see via a different move order. So here, instead of bishop takes e4, d5, knight d4, knight takes d4, knight d4, bishop e4. Okay, so same thing. d5 takes. Now, from here, black can try 2 moves. In a game between Zhigalko and Grishuk, black played c5. And here white perhaps had an edge, although the game ended up as a draw. Takes, takes, takes. Alright, maybe queen f6 is best, although even here after c5, white might enjoy a slight advantage. So Grishuk played queen g5, c4, takes, rook a3. And here, Grishuk probably should have played rook to b3, when he's only slightly worse after these captures. Instead he played king to h8, and now after rook to g3, queen b6, Zhigalko could have been clearly better after either queen to e2 or knight to d2, so either of these moves. Instead he played queen to h5, and now after bishop to f5, he was able to hold. So rook f3, bishop g6, rook f4, bishop h5, bishop c4, and a draw was agreed, as after rook takes b2, the position is completely equal. So a bit of a break there for Grishuk. So here, instead of Grishuk c5, I would recommend playing bishop takes d4 to preclude the bishop takes g7 sack. All right, bishop takes h7 is played here. King h7, queen d4. This was Anand Shirov from Moscow in 2007, drawn in 19 more moves. It's also possible to play c takes d4, aiming for perhaps a dark squared grip on the queen side and pressure on the c file, but this position too is objectively equal. Okay, so that's knight takes e4. Let's look now at e takes d4, c d4, knight e4. Well, again, this really looks like a blunder because of queen c2, queen e8, and now bishop to d5. So you might want to try to figure out how black saves his hide here. And the answer is knight to b4. So if queen takes e4, then takes, and f5, and the poor bishop is trapped, and black is slightly better here. Okay, another thing you might wonder about is queen takes c7. What about this one? With the idea on knight takes d5, queen a7. Well, the queen is rather seems to be rather caught here. So as far as I can tell, rook to b7 just wins her. So if queen to a8, knight to c7 finishes the job. And on queen takes a6, it seems that the same thing comes into play. Just knight to c7, and goodbye white queen. So queen c7 is not looking like a good idea, or at least queen takes a7 does not look like a good idea. Okay, so back to our main line here. So instead of bishop to d5, knight to c3. And here, white has faced both knight takes c3 and knight to f6. And black might be equal or close enough to equal in at least one of those lines. But knight to g3, which has not been played, may also be worthwhile. Knight to d5 is an interesting try, threatening not just f takes g3, excuse me, because the knight defends the bishop on e3, but also threatening queen takes c6, followed by knight to e7 check, winning a piece on the fork. So black is forced to play knight f5, saving his knight and covering the e7 square again. After rook f to e1, white has full compensation, maybe not more, but maybe a little bit more. So this is certainly possible for white. Alright, so that was e takes d4. And then finally, rook to a8, and this is the main move. Let me just double check here. Actually, e takes d4 might be played a little bit more, but I think rook a8 is more popular at the moment. Alright, well, the bad news is we've got quite a bit more to look at. So knight b to d2 here. And now black has tried different moves. And we'll look at bishop to b7 and h6. And h6 is the latest try. In general, I would say if you're researching this variation, there are two players that you have to look up, period. One is Shirov, who has been playing this off and on for quite a long time now. And recently, but very devotedly, Fabiano Caruana, who is playing this variation just constantly. So he is definitely going to be your number one guy if you take this variation up. But Shirov too. All right, so let's start with bishop to b7, the historically more common move. All right, here white has tried both bishop to c2 and rook to e1. Let's try bishop to c2. So now takes, rook e8, bishop to b1, and this is Ganguly Shirov from Moncada in 2009. Shirov won this game and started with knight to e7, but in fact he was in serious trouble just a few moves later. A better idea is knight to b4. Now, if e5, aiming for some bishop h7, knight g5, queen h5 action, black has de, then bishop takes e3. Okay, if ef, then we take on d2, and this is just great for black. I mean, he's got much better development and can simply win the f6 pawn if he wants it. It's clearly better. Okay, if f takes e3 instead, well, now knight to d7, and with no bishop on e3, there's no danger of white playing knight to g5. So after queen to b3, queen to e7, covering both b4 and f7, black is safe and enjoys a better position thanks to his superior structure. Alright, so that takes care of bishop to c2. If rook to e1, now we've got some more choices. Rook e8 was played by Shirov in Vaikanze in 2010 against Anand. So that game continued knight to g5, and here Shirov played rook to e7. In an earlier game, he had played rook to f8, which I would suggest he should do again, or someone playing this should do again. So rook e7, d5, knight b8, takes, knight f1, and white's a little bit better here, and went on to win in 55 moves, although Shirov actually managed to outplay Anand, and just before the time control made a big mistake that threw away a serious advantage. Okay, but rook to f8 is fine, and after knight f1, h6, I think black has no problems here. Alright, so that was rook e8. Instead, e takes d4, cd4, knight to b4 has certainly been played. And now bishop to g5, h6, bishop h4, and here I think black is in a bit of trouble. So this is from game Bologan Caruana, played in Reggio Emilia in 2009. Caruana won this game, but not because of this position. So there, play continued knight to d3, rook e3. Here, if knight to b4, then rook c3 is clearly better for white. So knight f4. And now here, Bologan played e5. And this was unclear. After d takes e5, d takes e5. So a very interesting and dynamic sacrifice. So we have this very murky position. Well, now it's not a sack. Now it's just even material. White has two knights for rook and a pawn. Very unclear, and Caruana went on to win this game. But from here, instead of e5, it looks like queen to c2 is quite strong, giving white a dangerous initiative. And of course, one idea is that after e5, if he hits the knight on f4, it can't go back to g6 because of queen g6. So it introduces some threats in that direction. Another idea, instead of knight to d3, is to play g5, which I think the computer likes at first, but it doesn't like it in the long run. So white should go for this sacrifice. Knight takes g5, hg5, bishop g5, bishop d4, knight f3, bishop b2, rook b1. Okay, here bishop b5 is bad because white trades. He plays queen f3, rook b to d1, and now white to move and win. What do you do? Rook to d7. This just destroys black immediately. Quick mate. So queen takes d7, queen f6 check. If king h7, then queen h6 check, followed by bishop to f6. Or after queen d7, queen f6, if king g8, just bishop to h6. So black has to give up the queen here, and that will be hopeless in this position as well. So instead of bishop to e5, bishop c3, rook e3, queen d7. So black returns the material, but instead of rook takes c3, when black can play knight e4, or maybe move like knight to d4, trying to clear the path for the rook to g3, and maybe the queen to come to the king side, instead white can play bishop takes f6. After bishop f6, knight to g5. So another power shot here, threatening queen h5 and or rook to g3. So takes, rook g3. Black can't play f6 because it's illegal. Queen e7 doesn't do anything because of queen to h5. So rook f to e8 trying to run away is probably the best try. But now white regains one piece. Now queen to d4 hits the second piece. And here white's attack is just too strong. So even in this position, although material is about equal, white's initiative rages on. So rook c7, e5 is a nice little trick. And here, white just has too much initiative here. So the black knight is in a little bit of danger. Certainly the black king is in some danger, and the bishop is vulnerable as well to back rank problems. So white is probably winning at this point. Now, that line was a bit too long. It was a 20-move variation. And while a lot of it was very forced, not all of it was. So there may be some improvements, but it certainly shows that playing g5 is quite dangerous for black. So this whole line, I think, with bishop to b7 is kind of risky. So h6 is the latest try, and in light of the variations we just saw, where black was repeatedly in a bit of trouble in the Ganguly-Shirov and Anand-Shirov game, and then Bolig and Caruana. So h6 is what Caruana has played lately. All right, rook e1, and here black can play either bishop to b7 or rook to e8, and again this will often transpose. So after rook to e8, we've got a couple more options, 3 options here to look at. There's bishop to c2, queen to c2, knight to f1, and d takes e5. So 4 options, and we'll try to avoid 5 though. All right, so bishop to c2. We'll start with this one, and this is kind of a modest retreat, just overprotecting the pawn on e4. And that's a drawback, by the way, with the bishop on e3. So, you know, it looks like it's developed relative to being on c1, but the drawback is that the pawn on e4 is more vulnerable, and it's not altogether clear much of the time what the bishop does on e3 anyway, aside from the d5 tactics. Well, black plays bishop to b7, which of course could not have been done with the rook back on b8 because of d5, but here it's okay. Now, white almost always plays d5, but bishop to b1 was played in a very high-level game earlier this year, Gashimov against Caruana in Vaikanze. And their play continued knight to b8, c4, takes, 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 and now rook to a3. And this position was equal, and the game was drawn in another 30 moves. All right, d5 is much more usual here, and then after knight to e7, either b4 straight away, or takes, takes, and b4. And so white is trying to, first of all, close the queen side, and then go for c4 to try to break on the c-file. So that's the general plan. However, after knight to g6, c4, as played in a game between Luther and Kashgaliev in Capella Legrand in 2008, here black should play c6. And it turns out that black is in time to blast the position open. White hasn't really managed to consolidate his extra space on the queen side, and if anything, black might be a touch better here. All right, so that was bishop a7, rook a7, b4. If b4, then bishop b3, rook e3. And here there was a game, Fedorchuk against Shirov from Khanty-Mansiysk in the World Cup in 2009. And there, Shirov played knight e takes d5, which was very interesting, but it led to a win for Fedorchuk. And it probably would have been better to just play knight to g6, followed by c6. That seems to be at least equal for black. So this was the first game they played in this line. Later, in a tiebreaker, Shirov varied and went on to win that game and the match. Okay, so that was bishop to c2 from this position. Queen to c2 was played in a game between Grishuk and Shirov from Rogaska Slatina in 2011. Grishuk won this game, and it went like this: bishop e7, takes, 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 rook e5, bishop a7, rook a7, f4, and here white has a bit of an initiative in the center of the board with the potential to transfer to the king side, and this initiative I think gives him an objective slight advantage, and he went on to win. However, I think instead of rook takes e5, d takes e5 would have been good enough for equality. Now there's no f4 business, while the advance with c4 is well met by c5. And if cb, ab, queen takes c5, black has rook takes a5. So this is equal. So queen to c2, I think, is not too terribly worrisome for black either. Okay, next up is knight to f1. So e takes d4, and now, okay, we can look at knight takes d4 and c takes d4. If knight d4, black can equalize in 2 ways. Knight takes d4, c5, and this clever move, the idea that if bishop takes a8, black takes on f2. This is equal for black. So is the more, let's say, restrained and sane knight to e5. For instance, knight f3, bishop b7, and we have the series of exchanges, and here the pawn on e4 is under enough pressure that black is equal. Well, all the same, that's better than c takes d4, because here, after rook takes e4, d5, bishop e3, knight e3, knight e5, we have the second Fedorchuk-Shirov game, and this one Shirov won. Now, it looks as if it was Fedorchuk who varied, but in fact, this is by transposition, so it was in fact Shirov who varied first, I think, in these two games. Anyway, here black is fine and went on to win, as I said. Okay, so we've looked at bishop c2, queen c2, and knight f1. Finally, d takes e5. And this was played in a game between Kobalia and Caruana from the European Championship in Plovdiv earlier this year in Bulgaria. So knight takes e5, knight e5, de5, knight f1. In this structure, you can see with the exchange of the d pawns and white not really having anything he can post up on d5. I mean, it's not the rouser structure where black has a pawn on c5. Here, black can always play c6 if need be. So this position is likely to be balanced, and in fact, it proves to be so. So queen e7, queen f3, bishop to d7, and yeah, this position just looks drawish, and nothing that happens the rest of the way changes that impression. Although here, with e takes d5, white could have inserted a little imbalance, but understandably he was concerned with something like queen to d6 followed by f7, f5, when this becomes a position where all three results are possible. So Kobalia, whether out of safety or simply, well, I should say, fear about this position or fear about Caruana's rating, decided to keep things flat. So he played bishop takes d5, and now further liquidations ensue. Bishop e6, takes, rook over, rook up, and really this could have been agreed drawn already, except I suspect they had some kind of anti-draw rules, so they had to go longer until they could engineer some kind of plausible repetition. So that's what happened. So just to zip through the moves here. Yeah, of course they could have already done a perpetual, but now they do. And the draw was agreed. Okay, so that was a lot of theory, and to just kind of draw some summary remarks here, I would say in both cases the positions become very much characteristic of, let's say, a typical closed Ruy Lopez. So we don't get a lot of this kind of freewheeling play, really, unless black plays e takes d4 and white plays c takes d4 back. You know, then the play can become very dynamic and sharp because of the imbalances. But unless that happens, most of the time you end up with these long maneuvering battles. So I hope I've shown you kind of, given you kind of a good lay of the land here, so you know how things work in the slow variations in the Neo-Archangelsk. So next time we get to the main line, where the play is very sharp and very tactical, and you know, there's not much maneuvering there at all. A far sharper and more tactical set of positions is going to arise. All right, so I will see you next time with that. Hope you enjoy it. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.